discussing the topic of faith and science. It's complicated. It is complicated. It is complicated in part because of the history of the interaction between faith and science. There have been controversial periods where it seemed like faith and science didn't get along very well. There are certain attitudes in the culture currently that are somewhat antagonistic to the faith because it is presumed, and it is a presumption, that because one adopts a scientific point of view, that they cannot therefore be a person of faith. I hope to show to you that over the course of this next 4 weeks, that is really a faulty notion. There's no reason that faith and science cannot get along, and yet at the same time, it is somewhat complicated, much like life is complicated. We read this morning the passage from Genesis, again a very familiar passage. It brings up one of the primary controversies that has often been surrounding faith and science, that of the origin of the universe, the origin of creation. I wanted to share with you a slightly different creation story that was written about the same time that the Genesis story was written, just to give you a clue as to how different it might be if we adopted a different version. Contrast the creation of the first man according to Genesis 2 with the creation of the first human beings according to the Mesopotamian tradition. True in both, the recipe starts with dust or clay, the very earth itself. But it is with the second ingredient that the difference is clearly seen. And here we have the variation in the Mesopotamian tradition. In the Enuma Elish, humanity's dust is mixed with the blood of a demon god killed for his treachery against the second generation of gods. Humans, therefore, are demons from their creation. According to Arathis, the second ingredient is the spit of the gods, a far cry from the glorious breath of the Creator. The creation process, according to Mesopotamian tradition, fits well with the overall low view of humanity professed by that culture. After all, according again to Arathis, humans were created with the express purpose of relieving the lesser gods from the arduous labor of digging irrigation ditches. On the other hand, the Genesis account conforms well to the high view of Scripture concerning humanity. Human beings, male and female, were created in the image of God. I want you to just consider for a moment the potential implications had the world gone with the Mesopotamian view. My own sense of that is that we might never have gotten to the degree of science that we have now. Why? Because we wouldn't have felt like we were worth any of the knowledge that science has given to us. And we wouldn't have felt like we were able to know anything about the natural world. Part of what ideas do, part of what the kind of assumptions that we make about the nature of ourselves, the nature of our world, those things guide us long term into either good or bad things. And to assume that we are demonic from the beginning, rather than to assume that we are created in God's image, invested by Him with His divine spark, that would lead us down a very, very different path. The Bible has its questions. There are biblical questions. And in Genesis in particular, there is one that is being asked. It's a theological question. You could say it's a philosophical question. It's a very human question. And that is, how did God's perfect get messed up. If God created the world, it was created, we would assume, in a perfect state. So if God, being God, creates a perfect thing, how is it that we have so many problems? How is it that we have pain? How is it that we have tragedy? How is it that we have suffering? How is it that we have death? How is it if God is God and He created us that we have such a messed up world? Genesis gives us that answer. The first 2 chapters of Genesis talk about the beauty of God's creation. They talk about the wonder of God's creation. They talk about the perfection of God's creation. And then in Genesis 3, we have a tragedy. The first true tragedy, and it's a human tragedy because humanity turns its back upon God. You can debate all kinds of features about Genesis. You can debate it scientifically, you can debate it theologically, but the fundamental question that is being asked and answered in Genesis is how God, being God, could create a perfect world, and yet we have messed it up. And then, how God begins to work to redeem all of that mess. Nicholas Buryayev, a Russian religious and political philosopher, says this: all beauty in the world is either a memory of paradise or a prophecy of the transfigured world. Let me read that again. All beauty in the world is either a memory of paradise or a prophecy of the transfigured world. Because of the story of Genesis, we have, if you will, a kind of a collective remembrance of God's intention. That God intends for our life to be good, for our life to be full, for our life to mean something. And that even in the midst of the struggle, even in the midst of the difficulties, even in the midst of the tragedies, there is still hope because God is still on our side and working to redeem the situation. That's a biblical question. It's a proper biblical question. It's a question you can ask of the Scripture, and the Scripture will give you an answer. It's not a question that science can answer. It's not a question that science can answer because science limits its focus necessarily to the things that can be directly observed, to the things that can be tested, to the things that can be repeated, to the things that you can put into some sort of theoretical framework that suggests data to back it up. Or the alternative, and this is something that many people, even within science, sometimes forget. Really, the data is intended to possibly falsify, to say the theory is not supported. And that is just as valid. In fact, it is a great part of the scientific endeavor because that gives you the opportunity to improve the theory. So that brings us to the scientific question. What questions do we ask of science, and how is science involved in this discussion? Science approaches the question of creation in a very different way than asking a theological question. It's not asking or assuming that the world was made in a perfect way. It's not assuming that God is behind the creation. Rather, it is asking an appropriate question for science to ask. How did the physical world come to its present state? And it asks that question in ways that it can observe and test and theorize about in a way that is scientifically valid. Now, the Big Bang Theory is not just a show on television. It's an enjoyable show. But the Big Bang Theory is a leading explanation, scientific explanation, about how the universe began. At its simplest, it talks about the universe as we know it, starting with a small singularity, then inflating over the next 13.8 billion years to the cosmos that we know today. That is science's answer to the question of how the universe began and became what we know today. People are sometimes uncomfortable with taking the story of creation from the Bible and taking the Big Bang Theory and putting them side by side and trying to reconcile them. Well, first of all, we shouldn't take 21st century scientific questions, ask them of the Scripture, and assume that the Scripture was written to answer them. The Scriptures don't know anything of scientific method. They don't know any of the theoretical and mathematical assumptions even that undergird scientific endeavor. It is inappropriate to take scientific questions and assume that the Bible can give us a valid answer. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. The Bible is a book of faith. Science is a book of faith in something else. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. It's still faith. It still makes assumptions, but it tests those assumptions in particular ways. So, the Bible answers certain questions that are valid for itself. And science answers certain questions that are valid for itself. To get the full picture, in my view, you need to ask both sets of questions. It is good to ask scientific questions. It is good to understand the natural world in a better way. We have medicines now that we would never have had if we had not approached things in this way. We have buildings now that we would never have had if we didn't approach things in that way. This morning, we have heat, which is a very good thing. All truth, to my mind, is God's truth. God is the God that knows all. What does the psalmist say in the scripture that we read this morning? The psalmist says, "Your ways are far above me. I cannot go where you are not. You are everywhere." This is not a God of the gaps kind of idea where God just explains those things that science cannot. No, God explains science. God created a natural order. God created a natural world. But God doesn't provide a scientific textbook in the Bible to answer those questions. God gives us the story of us and the story of His interaction with us in the Scripture so that we can come to a better relationship with Him. And so the challenge for us as people of faith in a scientifically based world is to fit the right answers to the right questions. That is, to know when we should ask a scientific question and go to scientific sources, and when we should ask a faith question and go to faith sources. We go to the Bible to find answers to questions that science cannot answer, because science is not equipped to answer those questions. Part of the issue comes when scientists try to answer questions that are beyond science using scientific principles, not understanding the limits of science. They try to endeavor into areas where they really have no knowledge and no basis to know. But here's one scientist who I think gives us a pretty good answer from a scientific perspective about what faith does and adds to this equation, if you will. When Albert Einstein was asked if he believed in God, here was his response. He said, "I'm not an atheist. I don't think I can call myself a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many languages. The child knows someone must have written those books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being towards God. We see the universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand these laws." Einstein tried to express these feelings clearly, both for himself and all of those who wanted a simple answer from him about his faith. And so in the summer of 1930, amid his sailing and ruminations in Kappel, that's in Germany, he composed a credo, What I Believe, that he recorded for a human rights group and later published. It concluded with an explanation of what he meant when he called himself religious. He said, "The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. It is a fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, a snuffed out candle. The sense that behind anything that can be experienced, there is something that our minds cannot grasp, whose beauty and sublimity reaches us only indirectly. This is religiousness. In this sense, and in this sense only, I am a devoutly religious man." We need to exercise care, I think, in our world that we apply scientific questions to scientific study and answers, and that we apply those questions that are fuller, those questions that are about meaning, those questions that are about beauty, those questions that are about how we are sinful and yet can be redeemed, that we apply those questions to our faith. In our efforts to listen to God's words to us, Mother Teresa said, we often neglect what might be called His first word to us. This is the gift of ourselves to ourselves, our existence, our nature, our personal history, our uniqueness, our identity, all that we have. And indeed, our very existence is one of the unique and never to be repeated ways God has chosen to express Himself in space and time. Each of us, because we are made in God's image and likeness, is yet another promise that He has made to the universe, that He will continue to love it and care for it. You and I, because we have an answer from Scripture that says we are loved by God, we are created by God, we exist, have our being, and have our meaning in the fact that He is embedded in us, His image is in us. That creates all kinds of possibility. It means, for example, that the stranger that you encounter at the grocery store is a creation of God intended for His own purpose. A person that may somehow cajole you, a person that may somehow irritate you, is somehow still a creation of God to be loved by Him. And because He loves you and has shown you His love, to be loved by you, to show His love to the world. Some people will never read a religious text. They will approach the world only in scientific terms. And so we have to present an alternative view. A view that opens a fuller answer to questions that all of us from time to time may ask. And the text, I'm afraid, that we have to offer is ourselves. How we answer the question of whether or not they are a person that can be loved will communicate the answer they are seeking, perhaps from the only source they will ever know. That puts an extreme responsibility, if you will, on us. We'll sometimes fail at it. I know I do often enough. But it is still God's call to us, because His image is replicated in us. And we are called to show that image and to show His love to the world. Science has its questions and answers. The Bible has its own as well. But the fact is that Jesus as the answer is expressed most clearly today in the endeavors and actions that you and I take to show Him.